I'm here with two panelists, Jan and Jingmin, and they're going to introduce themselves. But we're here to talk about the topic Empower, Women for Clean Energy Access. So just to set the stage a bit, according to some recent data, 1.1 billion people are without electricity around the world. That number rises to about 3 billion when you're talking about people who burn solid fuels for cooking and heating. So the seventh goal of the SDGs is ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. We're here in Kigali, so to bring you some Africa-specific data, 2 of 3 sub-Saharan Africans lack access to energy. I'm going to turn it over to my panelists to tell us a little bit more about how we can empower women for clean energy access. I'll start with you, Jan, if you can introduce yourself and answer the question, can you tell us some priority actions that governments can take to benefit women when delivering on their commitments to delivering on clean energy access? Governments have committed around the world to the 7th goal of the SDGs, and what priority actions should we expect governments to take in honoring that commitment?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Tameisha, and lovely to be here also with Jingmin. I am Jan Corfee-Morlot. I work for the New Climate Economy, where I'm a senior advisor. And I also work for myself. I have a small company out of Paris, the 3 Cs. And recently, in my own consulting work, I did some work in depth on sub-Saharan Africa and achieving clean energy access. What does that mean? So I'll share with you some of the results of that work, and I'm happy to kind of jump into the question around policy. I mean, just to put in context some of what Tameisha told us, what the numbers that she presented mean in sub-Saharan Africa is essentially 1 out of 2 people here in sub-Saharan Africa lack access to electricity. And if you account for those with poor quality, that rises to 2 out of 3, as she said. 80% of the demand, and here I'm talking about first-time access, is in rural sub-Saharan Africa. 13 countries, it varies by country, so 13 countries in sub-Saharan Africa actually only have 25% access to electricity. That is a stark set of figures. And when we go to clean cooking, it's essentially a majority of people who are still cooking with traditional fuels, extremely polluting, extremely time-consuming for women in particular, who typically have the burden of finding and bringing the fuels that they cook with. It's not only lost time, but it's also lost productivity for women who multitask, who have other jobs, not to mention beyond the household. Quite often they're working in fields, in agriculture, and adding to the burden of their life is actually collecting traditional fuels, which then lead to essentially health hazards for these women and their families. So what are some of the solutions? And you've asked about the policies and what governments can do. Essentially, we need to be targeting and building women into the solution. It has to be policy designed with a gender lens to be effective. And what the research has told us is that we can leverage women as agents of change. They can be change makers in society for clean energy access. Governments can help create policies that lead to more and better employment for women in this sector and create leadership opportunities for women by funding some of the types of programs that will lead to change in the sector. And that includes not only supporting women to lead their own small, medium-sized businesses, but also opening opportunity in government and in decision-making processes that have typically prioritized and been majority led by men. So one thing that has happened in recent years, in the last couple of years, is that, for example, the Economic Community of West African States, which is a collaboration across 15 member governments in West Africa, committed to the goal of mainstreaming women into public and private sector decision-making, energy jobs, and energy infrastructure decision making. And so this hasn't actually been done yet, but if it were done, and as it occurs, I think what we will see is a fundamental shift in the way policies and programs to develop and diffuse access to clean energy occurs in a way that is sensitive to women's needs and a proactive, pro-women set of outcomes. I think I'd like to leave it there, and there's more I could say, but I think we should be having a conversation, so I don't really want to dominate at this point, and we could come back if you want to know more about policy.
Okay, sure, we can circle back to you. I'd like to pose a question to my second panelist today. So China is one of the world's leading countries in electricity production from renewable energy sources, and it is a leader in the related technologies like electric vehicles. Can you tell us what lessons learned by China and by the Chinese government in delivering access to the many millions of people in the country can be shared with us here in Africa? So we are in Rwanda. What lessons learned from China are applicable to the African context, and if you want to be specific, to the sub-Saharan context?
All right. Thank you, Tameisha, and thank you, Wang. And first of all, I would like to introduce a little bit about myself and where I'm from. And I'm Wang Jingmin. I'm from Shandong University of Economics, Shandong University of Finance and Economics. Sorry, I'm a little bit nervous. And anyway, I'm from China, and my expertise is a kind of low carbon economy. So when I got this topic, I think, wow, it is out of my professional kind of, but it is a very interesting topic. So this question, when I got it, I think it's based on an assumption that women in underdeveloped areas need to collect firewood and to do a lot of houseworks and to obtain energy, and which keep them from self-development opportunities. And through the popularization of solar energy or other green energy, and women are liberated and can be trained to become qualified technical workers. So, but in most parts of China, just as you mentioned, women are not restricted by the work of collecting firewood or do so much heavy works only at home, and because Chinese government has been working to developing wind, solar, hydropower, and other clean energy all the time. At least in the last decade, we do a lot of work. And nowadays, China declared full electrification in year 2015. That means we got electricity supply to everywhere, every corner of China. So this is really brilliant work, not because I'm Chinese. You can imagine that there's a country and with 1.4 billion people, and a lot of people, they live in remote areas and isolated, and we have to go to the environment is not very friendly, and to contact all the devices to there. So this is really hard work. And for China, we went through 2 waves. So the first wave provided electricity to 97% of the population by the late 1990s. And extensions to the power grid carried electricity to about 80% of rural Chinese. So 80%, there's still 20 left. And the second wave in year 2012, and the central government issued a 3-year action plan, which is called Electricity for All. And we do succeeded. And now everywhere we got the electricity. And what can the rest of the world, for example, our friends in Africa, can learn from it? I think we can summarize into 3 aspects. The first is the coordinate all stakeholders. So in the conference, I heard a lot of speakers. They talk about we should cooperate with the stakeholders, and that is what we do. And China's central government provided policy leadership and investment, but with extensive local coordination. And the provincial government examines local conditions and coordinates project implementation. So most of the investment, mostly more than 60% investment is from the central government. So we do a lot of work for that, and the other 40 is from the provincial and some private sectors, etc., and NGOs. So this is the first one. And the second, I think, is to select appropriate technologies. So the final round, or the second wave of electrification, was split 50-50 between grid extension and off-grid solar PV. So we established the solar system for the rural area. So that will cost them less than the electricity supply, because I have some data here. So even the electricity is more reliable. The grid connection proved too expensive and inflexible for the remotest populations. So it is really hard. So we just use the power system to instead of it. So the third one, I think, it is to we can talk about is to embed electrification in our central government's development plans. So yeah, we do a lot of, every 5 years we do the plan and we just put it in it. So that I think maybe is something we can we can learn from what China's government do. Yeah.
Thank you. That's fantastic. And what's most intriguing about what you both talked about, even though my question to you wasn't specific on the government's intervention, is it circled back to the key role that governments must play in kind of democratizing energy access. In order for access to reach all, it has to be embedded in the policy framework.
Yeah.
But like you said, only 60% came from the central government.
Yeah.
I'd like to pose to both of you, what is the role of the private sector? How can we have entrepreneurs and kind of non-government stakeholders play a role in helping us meet that seventh SDG? Because it can't all fall on the government.
Yes.
I'd like to start with you, Jan.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's so much to talk about in this area. I mean, I think Jingmin, you touched on a lot of the key points that are actually extremely relevant and the center of energy access policy, clean energy access policy in Africa. As I mentioned, the rural population, the majority of the rural population here lacks access to electricity. And so when you have a situation where rural population is really where the need is, but the fundamental system in place today to deliver electricity in Africa, throughout Africa, and in fact most of the developed world and the rest of the world as well, are grid-based systems. Grid-based systems are fabulous in terms of serving population where there's high density, but they don't do very well in rural areas. It's very expensive to extend the grid to rural areas, and sometimes it just doesn't make economic sense. And even where you can justify it economically, and there are places in Africa, South Africa, for example, is 100% grid, almost 100% grid-based electrification, and almost 100% electrification. So they've succeeded there. But where they've done that, and where the grid is extended to even rural areas, it's very expensive to do that. And essentially, you set up a system that has cross-subsidization between urban and rural population. So it's not very practical, especially in other parts of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that have state-owned enterprises that are running the grid companies. And these are quasi-private, so we can say they're private, they're still state-owned, and they're historically and notably inefficient. There's a lot of good research on this that documents the electricity losses in the grid, the financial returns, which are very poor, sometimes negative, quite often negative. And so essentially they're subsidized companies, state-owned companies. Subsidized for a reason, because there's a lot of public good in electricity access, but they're not particularly efficient partners. And they're especially ill-adapted to serve rural populations. So today what's amazing is this off-grid, mini-grid opportunity, which essentially, let's cluster that together to call it decentralized, because you have renewable energy technologies plummeting in terms of price and very price competitive with fossil fuel alternatives. What you see is both economic opportunity in the grid systems, but also in the off-grid, mini-grid, decentralized systems. So decentralized renewables today can provide very cost-effective access to rural population in the rural, in the outside of urban areas in Africa. And the private sector has a huge role to play. In fact, probably the main role to play. And where you see this successful operation of solar home systems, so fully off-grid, at a small scale provision, where you see that, you're seeing private companies running this provision. And where you see mini grids coming in, typically it's a really useful partnership between the public sector, which has put in place the right kinds of policies to incentivize and establish tariff systems that will allow the private investors to make money in those mini grids. They're much closer to grid-based operations, much like a real business, but they aren't, most countries it's not viable today. It still needs public subsidy. So you need this partnership, public-private partnership. A few countries where that's working well include Kenya and Tanzania. There aren't that many examples, but it's coming. Maybe up and coming also in Nigeria, Ethiopia.
That's fantastic. 1 minute, if you have any final intervention, perhaps on the role of private sector or on how we can get more women to the table with these kinds of conversations.
Well, maybe just 1 or 2 minutes. In China, the Chinese government encourage company to invest in the rural area and to find the business opportunity there. So, for example, I can give you an example of the women entrepreneurship. Last year, I watched a news that there is a woman and who is the leader of who is the chairman of Liansheng New Energy Group, and she organized an organization which is called Women in Renewables Asia. We call it WIRA, and that was successfully held in Shanghai. So the alliance was jointly initiated by her and the other 13 outstanding women in the field of energy, new energy. So the aim of this organization is to build a women's self-development platform and support the environment to achieve gender diversification in the industry and become a new energy source. So this kind of thing happened almost all the time in China. So nowadays, this is really a great opportunity, not only to the Chinese men and also to Chinese women to start up their company, to start up their business, to find out what this society asks them to do. So to seek the opportunity, not only satisfy the profit, but also satisfy the social need. Yeah.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much. So what I've heard today, to summarize, is there's definitely a role for government to play as we talk about securing access to clean energy, but the private sector, women leaders like yourselves, all have key roles to play. And it was a fantastic opportunity to speak with you. My name is Tameisha Henry. I'm a U.S. diplomat and a fellow of the AFGG. Thank you so much for joining us.